Ja, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen zur 16. Thomsen-Vorlesung. Immer noch ein bisschen unter Corona-Regime. Das gehört zu dem Plan, den der Mieter dieses Raums vorlegen muss. Aber ich sehe, das wird ja auch kreativ gehandhabt. Ja, der russische Überfall auf die Ukraine am 24. Februar ist von Olaf Scholz ja als eine Zeitenwende bezeichnet worden und das gilt in besonderem Maß auch für uns, die Eurasienabteilung, denn nach 27 Jahren sind die gemeinsamen Forschungen von russischen und deutschen Archäologen und Archäologinnen erst einmal zu Ende gegangen. Also alle gemeinsamen Kooperationen, Grabungen, Konferenzen und so weiter sind eingefroren und nach dem Stand der Dinge, ich meine die Massaker und die Kriegsgräuel der russischen Armee, wird es auch lange Zeit keinen neuen Anlauf zu unbeschwerter gemeinsamer wissenschaftlicher Arbeit geben. Wir werden deshalb in den nächsten Jahren oder vielleicht im nächsten Jahrzehnt Archäologie in Eurasien ohne Russland betreiben müssen. Und die Eurasienabteilung 2.0 wird sich am Ende des Krieges natürlich auf die Ukraine, aber auch auf andere Regionen, in denen wir noch nicht oder nur sehr wenig gearbeitet haben, wie etwa Armenien oder Kasachstan, konzentrieren. Von Anfang an betrieb die Eurasienabteilung vor allem eine Archäologie der Steppe und das werden wir auch weiterführen. Und unser heutiger Redner, Professor Michael Frachetti, ist einer der führenden Archäologen auf dem Gebiet der Eurasischen Steppe und Zentralasiens, insbesondere auf dem Gebiet der bronzezeitlichen Ökonomien und Netzwerke zwischen China und Westeurasien. Ich will nur ganz kurz ihn einführen. 1999 beendete er sein Studium mit einem Master an der University of Cambridge, UK, und 2004 wurde er an der Universität von Pennsylvania promoviert. Seit 2005 unterrichtet er an der Washington University in St. Louis, wo er seit 2018 auch Professor ist. Michael Frachetti war 2005 als Postdoktorand in Berlin an der Eurasienabteilung, also schon eine gewisse Zeit her. Und seitdem stehen wir in einem ständigen wissenschaftlichen Austausch. 2017 wurde er korrespondierendes Mitglied des Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts und ist auch Mitglied des Beirats unserer Zeitschrift Eurasia Antiqua. In Deutschland ist er jetzt häufiger, denn er gehört zum Kern der Arbeitsgruppe Volcanoes, Climate and History am Zentrum für interdisziplinäre Forschung der Universität Bielefeld. Das ist ja auch einigen hier ein Begriff. Eine von seinen wichtigsten Veröffentlichungen erschien 2012 in Current Anthropology, wo er argumentierte, dass sich der eurasische Steppenpastoralismus in der westlichen, zentralen und südöstlichen Steppe entlang unterschiedlicher lokaler Pfade entwickelte und eben die Entwicklung jeweils regionaler Interaktionsnetzwerke im späten 4. und 3. Jahrtausend auslöste. Und sein Begriff Inner Asian Mountain Corridor ist inzwischen ganz in die Wissenschaft eingegangen und hat zu einer vielleicht einer neuen Sicht auf die steppenpastoralen Gesellschaften geführt, die sowohl in der Gestaltung großer geografischer Räume mit gemeinsamen kulturellen Normen eine Rolle spielen, aber auch bei religiösen Praktiken, der Bewertung im Handel, dem Warenaustausch und mehr. Und Das ist ein Pfad, der sicher zu verfolgen ist. Er hat in den letzten Jahren auch viel mit bioarchäologischen Ansätzen gearbeitet, vor allen Dingen alter DNA. Und dem wenigen, was ich hier so andeute, sehen Sie schon, dass wir eigentlich ganz viele gemeinsame Berührungspunkte in unserer wissenschaftlichen Arbeit haben. Und deswegen freue ich mich, lieber Michael, dass du den weiten Weg nach Berlin auf dich genommen hast, um heute hier zu sprechen. Please, Michael, that's your stage.
Good evening. Thank you, Sven, for the lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming out on a rainy night. I'm delighted to be here. I have a very close place in my heart for Berlin and for the DIE, the Eurasian Abteilung. This is essentially where my academic post-PhD career was launched, in the sense that I realized that this was the only place in the world, perhaps, outside of Eurasia itself. Outside of Central Eurasia. We are, of course, in Eurasia. But outside of the regions where we will be discussing, where you could have 20, 25, 30, 45, however many, right, specialists and scholars in one room who actually live in the same city. For most of us, this demands a massive conference or massive symposium to draw together so many specialists. And so I'm very delighted to be back in Berlin, one of the major epicenters for the research on Eurasia, to present under these auspicious times of the Thomsen lecture. You've probably noticed the allusion to Christian Thomsen here with my lead slide. Stone, bronze, and iron. I won't be talking about the 3H system, so that's good. But I do want to make an allusion to the idea of typology, and typology will be a theme that I'll be discussing here today. But really, there's another moment that I think needs to be addressed, at least minimally, and that is something that was alluded to in Sven's introduction, and that is the progress of Eurasian archaeology in and of itself, and the risky position we are in today with some of the global events that we are all well aware of. I began working in the region close to 20, I can't count off the top of my head, 23 or 24 years ago now, as a student, and the progress, what I'll be discussing today, is directly related to our ability as a discipline to accumulate information under new scientific methods and to change our understanding of archaeology much more broadly outside of the realm of Central Asia or Eurasia. And that's dependent upon the political and social connectivity that we have with so many scholars and individuals in that part of the world. And so to see that kind of connectivity threatened by political acts is very scary on the one level, but also very problematic when we consider what the impact of that kind of war and international political intrigue has on our discipline, on our ability to understand the past. And so in a lot of ways, this presentation is an overture to the past 20 years of progress that we've made in the discipline, with the fearful yet optimistic idea that will continue further going on as we move into the next decade of research. So my title obviously discusses revolutions, and so I want to start going back to the idea of revolutions in some sense. And of course, for all those who study archaeology, this is nothing new. For those of you who were confused as to why I used the word revolution in my discussion, we can talk about it afterwards at the reception. But one of the things that I think is important to start at the outset, whenever you discuss Eurasian archaeology, is the relationship between typological thinking and misconceptions about the actual archaeological past. And this, of course, is ironic in a way, given that I'm at the Thomsen lecture, right? Because this is typological thinking at the foundation of our discipline. And in many ways, typological thinking, which is the core of archaeological research at some level, is also at the basis of understanding major, what we have called revolutions in human past, be it agricultural production or the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. The urban revolution, again, the quote here taken from Child is in fact from his paper on the urban revolution. Whether it be the metallurgical revolution, I mean, now you can kind of look through the literature over the past 50 years or more, and you see scholars using this phrase, something is revolutionary because it's a change. Well, this presents a problem, right? Because now as the field has matured, we know that agricultural revolutions didn't happen as a revolution. In fact, it happens as a very slow process. And so I fail to understand anything revolutionary about it. Likewise, the same could be said for urbanism. The extension of these ideas about what it takes to actually build a city versus build a very, very large town versus an aggregate of small settlements versus a single monumental structure may in fact be not so fundamentally or say typologically that different, but they're only different in the way that we as archaeologists frame them. And so this whole lecture, in a sense, is devoted to the idea of, on the one hand, again, providing an overture to some of these ideas, right? Typological and revolutionary phases of human history, while at the same time, I want to convince you of a very simple idea, and that is that much of what we've seen as revolutionary in the human campaign over the last 10,000 years is in fact a much more granular process of individuals making actual choices. And that the focus on choice, specific choices, is actually we can begin to address this topic now by virtue of the fact that we're arriving at the data that gives us a lens to see those choices in very high resolution. And so today I'm going to hopefully walk you through a series of choices that affected Central Asia over roughly 5,000 years and show how our data today allows us to sort of articulate and give a picture of those choices in much greater resolution than maybe we had prior, and thus, in a way, break down some of the typological thinking that has been at the core of Eurasian archaeology, but a much wider field of archaeology in general. I'm not the only person, of course, to focus on choice. And ironically, in a way, in Graham Barker's book, The Agricultural Revolution, in his discussion of the agricultural revolution, he highlights this essential point, that any general theory about agricultural revolution, and you can insert the word you like, it could be urban revolution or others, any theory about revolution in prehistory is that people then and now had choices and made decisions in historically contingent contexts. And it's the problem of defining and understanding those historically contingent contexts that is actually the work of us all here. I mean, this is really what we're trying to really define, is that contextual space within which a person equipped with the same rational thoughts perhaps as we did and the same irrational thoughts as we have might make a choice to do this or do that, and how those choices then dictate the path dependencies of our societies going forward. So that's really the focus of today, is to understand choice in its sort of multi-elemental, multi-factored reality. So I showed this slide not long ago at a conference organized by Barbara Hellwing, who's in the audience, concerning mobility, and I've modified it, or let's say it was modified for one of the other lectures, but I'm sticking with the slide and I want to keep sinking into it because this is a direction of my research now that I'm very interested in. And that is how we begin to rationalize the multiple factors that go into human choice. So this is drawn somewhat from sociological or economic decision theory. There's lots of other ways in which you can, there's a scholarly work around the parameters of choice. But I tried to focus on elements that I thought were relevant and obtainable through the archaeological record. So not just things that might affect choice, but things that you could actually find evidence for. And so you can see on the outer ring 4 major ones, which we'll talk about many of them tonight: politics, environment, tradition, or technology. And then, of course, at the intersections of these are some proposed ways in which those choices might be, or let's say those impulses, those factors would be reflected in different choices. So, the intersection of politics and environment might lead us to understand something about sovereignty. Again, thinking about the contemporary conflicts, you can understand how sovereignty or conflict might lie at the intersection of the environmental or geographic space that one is in and their political power. So this is a sort of a generic theoretical diagram for us to sort of rationalize or begin to, let's say, approach the question of choice from something more tangible than just saying people made choices. Okay, well, clearly people made choices. This is a fairly empty statement at one level. But archaeologically, we can now, I think, delve into the elements of choice that are visible and recoverable in the archaeological record. And that's really what my point is going to be tonight. So an example of maybe how archaeology can be framed in two different conversations is the spread and globalization of agricultural foods. This is a map sequence that I borrowed from my colleague Xinyi Liu, who works primarily in China, but who's a very global thinker in terms of the spread and adoption of different kinds of domestic crops and their influence on cuisine and food. There was a paper published a couple years ago in Quaternary Science Reviews. And if we take a time slice, somewhat arbitrary time slice, like 5,000 BC, we see different worlds of agriculture at this time, specifically around the four crops that you see in the corners. So blue is wheat and barley, sort of Southwest Asian crop package. Broomcorn millet is in red, rice is in green, and you'll see African millet and sorghum will pop up in orange momentarily. But at 5,000 BC, there was an emerging world of interactions, which is a very coarse-grained way of saying people were making tons of choices about how to grow wheat and barley. But we would, as archaeologists, categorize this as a system, right? This is the spread of the Neolithic to Europe. This is the adoption of farming amongst Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Like, these are choices that are actually being made, and scholars like Marek Zwiebelfeld, wrote about these kinds of choices in very specific terms. But nevertheless, archaeologists we like to create these large overviews of how these processes took place without necessarily getting down to those granular levels. As we move through time, we see this process evolving, and of course, at every step, it demands that choices be made. The individuals, do I have a pointer? Let's see if this works. Yeah. So, the individuals living here, and these are reflective of the sites that I myself have excavated, had to make choices about which plants to put in the ground and which plants to feed their animals and which plants to eat and which plants to sprinkle over their dead bodies. And those choices were not arbitrary, they were influenced by different things. And so a map like this, while it's extremely useful to illustrate the spread of these crops, it can oftentimes mask the essentials of those choices that are being made that allow this map to come into being. An example of this, which is a very interesting one, was recently published by William Taylor and Svetlana Schneider, who bring us a bit of sort of a small dabble of information from high in the mountains of Tajikistan, or I believe Kyrgyzstan, at the site of Obishir 5, where a population of Neolithic hunter-gatherers appears to be auditioning for the first time domesticated sheep and goat. Probably goat, but nevertheless, using zooms, they're able to sort of detect the likely inclusion of domesticated animals or pre-domesticated animals in the assemblage of foods and assemblage of behaviors that the inhabitants living in the cave at Obishir 5 would have had in their repertoire. This is exactly the kind of construction around choice that I'm talking about, because if in fact this is the case, it might simply be a single spark, one population that is tired of chasing goats through the mountains and says, we met these people, they have these amazing animals around their houses down in the valleys. Let's make the choice to take some, or to borrow some, or to bargain for some, or whatever they did, right? Those singular decisions in some cases are the trigger, the waterfall for the processes that we've seen in the previous map. And so I like this example because it illustrates this incipient stage, this auditioning phase perhaps. And until we have more information, we have to understand it under those terms. It may come out that tons of people were doing this, in which case then we'll be at the point where the data is rich enough to discuss the kinds of variations and choices that are available. And that's where I want to turn to next. Not only do we have case studies of individual choices that were potentially catalytic in understanding, say, something like the development of domesticated animal herding, but rather multiple choices that are being made simultaneously amongst many different spheres to create trends that we then see as typological shift. Right? This is what I'm trying to tease apart, is the relationship between individual choice, variability within choice, and what ultimately comes down to us as archaeologists as agglomerated typological groups that say these are now pastoralists, or these were farmers, or these were people who kept these kinds of animals versus those kind of animals. And it's not without the rich data that we can begin to pull apart some of these choices. So if we look at the domesticated animals and the pastoral economies of the region between 3000 and 2000 BC, we see a very different picture of choices at the broad level. Again, this is just that broad typological approach to say the concentrations of certain kinds of animals in the east, central, north, and mountain regions of Central Asia led me, in fact, to start thinking about the mountains as a special place. And it's this kind of typological thinking that we must rely on, just like Thomsen and Child, in the beginning stages of our work. But as it becomes richer and richer, we can delve in deeper to understand what is actually happening. And this is a slide that one of my current graduate students assembled for me. It's been assembled before, but we're increasing the number of data points on it. You see one on the left-hand side by a recent a scholar, I think she's in Munich now, Ashley Haruda. She's done another revolution of this work. But the bar graphs are really what I want to illustrate. And there you see different regional percentages based on environmental boundaries for herd composition. Which animals do you include? How many cattle, how many horses, how many sheep? Well, the reality is that there's a lot of choice being reflected in those different sites. Now, if we take the methodology at face value and say that these are indeed comparable data sets, which is another conversation, but let's just take that as a possibility. What it would then illustrate to me is that people who are living in relatively similar environments, it's easy to say that they're going to have a different strategy from those who are living in a different environment. This is that initial kind of categorical approach. But the question now is, can we go into an environmental space, the mountain regions of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor, or the central and open steppes of Kazakhstan, and see a broad range of diversity within those different sites? Can we actually say that this family and this family are choosing different things? And the answer, I hope you can guess, is going to be yes, we can. To do that, I want to take you to a couple of case studies, some of which might be familiar to you, others which maybe not so much. The first is the site of Bigash and Taspas in Dali, which are distributed like this in the mountains, the Jungar Mountains of eastern Kazakhstan, at different elevations, roughly between 900 and 1,600 meters elevation. And here you see, for example, the use of grains in a ritual context. The first evidence we had for the use of domesticated crops in the region. It was surprising to find these grains sprinkled over cremated humans, even more surprising to find cremations in settlement sites. But nevertheless, this was our first introduction to domesticated grains, not as a food source, initially at least thought to be used as a ritual practice. As we began to dig more and explore more and apply different methodologies, however, we began to realize that whether it's Bigash or Taspas or Dali, these neighboring sites, each of them had a slightly different character to the nature of their plant use. And in fact, some of them, like Dali and Taspas, I point this slide out to illustrate the geography, they're less than 1 kilometer from one another. So these are people who knew each other at the same time. Contemporaneous sites, communities with similar material culture, they would have known one another if they were there at the same exact time, at least had the capacity to do so. Yet their economic systems were completely different. Nevertheless, these communities participated in a series of choices that led to major effects. This is another way of envisioning that map I showed before about the spread of crops from China to the west and Western crops to the east. And this corridor, which I've argued for in numerous cases, is now, I'd like you to conceptualize it not so much just as an environmental space, but as a territory for these kinds of intensive sets of choices when options became highly diversified. Very complex in the way that if you go out to the grocery store today and you walk down the aisle, you have dozens of choices of what kind of honey to buy or how much fat content you want in your cheese or your milk. And we imagine in prehistory that these populations had no choice, that they just simply were born a pastoralist and lived a pastoralist and died a pastoralist. I think that the corridor actually gives us the opportunity to understand that economic choices in this region were highly contextualized. They were contextualized around the environment, but also on social networks, and I'll take you through some of those other options. But everything from which animals you keep, to which grains you grow, to which ones you grow for your animals, to which ones you grow for yourself, can be negotiated according to these social conditions. So for example, a recent study looking at the human isotopic structure, the isotopic structure of human populations throughout the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor illustrates that not only were populations eating C4 crops, so probably millet in this case, but that they were doing it in different ways amongst different communities with high degrees of variation, but nevertheless trending towards less and less as you move in higher elevation. So populations only separated by a couple hundred meters in elevation might have had completely different dietary repertoires in terms of how much of the grains they were actually eating. Now, the reasons behind this could be simply that they didn't like millet. Millet is not necessarily the most delicious food on the planet, but other options are on the table. For example, maybe some of them were growing the millet for their animals, and that millet was introduced not so much as a food for humans, but as a food for animals. And I note here a variety of sites throughout the region where millet has been detected in early times in the Bronze Age, and the majority of those red dots are in fact pastoralist sites, sites we would categorize as being occupied by seasonal herders. So maybe millet is indeed a food for animals. Digging deeper into the site of Dali, for example, and Bigash, we were able to distinguish between different behaviors at different sites for different animals. So, for example, sheep and goat were foddered with millet substantially as early as the early Bronze Age, whereas cattle were not. So the choice to grow millet wasn't just about whether you knew how to do it or whether this was sort of given to you or whether it diffused in some unagentive way, but rather, once this technology was available, how did you deploy it? And did your neighbors do the same thing? And I think that the data that we're now being able to illustrate from isotopes and from other kinds of analyses like that, residue analyses, biomarkers, et cetera, is beginning to illustrate that this is not an equal playing field for everybody. Different choices come with different kinds of opportunities. Some people didn't maybe eat it at all. They just buried their bodies with them. So here, example, you see the wheat and barley, in this case wheat, same morphological style as that which is found in the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor, buried in the elaborate cemetery of Shaohe, but as food offerings. So likely they were eating them, but also with it being used and adopted as a ritual object. So to wrap up the idea about diets anyway, I've made the argument that we are not what we eat. We are partly what we eat, in a biological sense, but we are what we choose. And those choices come from different sources, from ritual, from hospitality, from medicine, whether or not you have animals to feed, whether you want to grow a crop because it smells nice, whether you want to smoke it, etc. Make beer with it. Of course, the choices you make have implications, right? This is what we tell our kids. If you decide that you're going to keep certain kinds of animals in certain kinds of environments, the implications are you have to keep them alive and keep them healthy. So that means that you're going to also then have to make choices about how much you move, how little you move, how far you move, et cetera. And if we look at the mobility patterns that we can reconstruct on the basis of environmental reconstruction or on the basis of actual isotopic work, so environmental work, illustrating different kinds of pastures being used in different seasons, we can reconstruct general patterns of transhumance up and down the mountain corridor, for example. But it's really not until we have a picture of the variability, the potential variability that the environment brings to these individuals, that we begin to see the impact of different choices. So here you see just 10 modeled iterations of movement up and down different mountain pathways. In this case, modeled on the idea that sheep like grass. So if sheep go up the mountain to eat grass, they come down in the winter to eat lowland grass. And these are all tuned to environmental factors, each year introducing different kinds of variation. And it's not until you see the aggregated combination of those choices that a pattern begins to emerge. And it's at that point that we see these red pathways that carve deeper tracks into the landscape and define new social contours, new interactive contours, ultimately essentially shaping the pathways of what we could imagine as a very diffuse network of the Silk Road. But of course, connectivity doesn't just mean what you eat. It doesn't mean just where you go. It also means what you believe and how well you get along with the people around you when they believe it. So one of the more interesting sort of ideas that we've been playing around with is that the spread and widespread utilization of similar burial styles, which typologically has been used to categorize culture groups, et cetera, is less about participation in a particular culture group and more about the ability to interact and share choices. So if I choose to send my dead relatives off to an afterworld that you believe in, we have a greater likelihood of at least not going to war. And so those kinds of choices aren't just simply motivated by what you believe yourself, but motivated by the beliefs you have as they relate to the connectivities that you have through other vectors, like, say, pastoralism. So in this case, looking at the spread of ideological material symbol systems between vastly different culture groups. Xiaohe Jijia on the right-hand side, Go-No-Tepe on the left-hand side, we see a very, very similar vernacular, very similar syntax of how populations built their burials, even though inside those burials there was a variable set of data. Like, you would never confuse the ceramics from the right-hand side from those at the left-hand side. But taken as a syntactical approach of how you understand a good burial, these things are actually quite similar. About to be published on the 30th, I think the 30th of November, is a paper led by Wayne Powell and a number of other metallurgy specialists, which illustrates that not only were ideological systems shared in terms of burial, but ideological systems shared in terms of value were also transported very long distances. In this case, we have they've analyzed a large collection of tin ingots from the Uluburun shipwreck, which sunk off the coast of Turkey in something like 1320. And that tin has now been analyzed at a high resolution, and we can fairly comfortably say that about 1/3 of the ingots themselves come from Mushistan in Uzbekistan. And I know that, I think I saw Nick Barovka arrive here a little bit late there. So due to the work that Nick has done and others have done at that site, illustrating the sort of extraction of metal amongst smaller scale populations, we now begin to see that the choice of those communities to trade that tin down the line, likely across the northern fringes of Iran, through a number of different political communities like the Assyrians, the Mitanni, the Hittites, ending up in the coastal city of Haifa to be resmelted somewhere in that process and loaded onto the Uluburun shipwreck, and then to sail around halfway around the Mediterranean and to sink, is an incredibly complex set of choices that people are making, but one that importantly illustrates their ability to communicate at a conceptual level about value. This world is much smaller than we imagined in the past, and those choices that people make are not as distinct as one would have expected. Think of the numbers of different cultural and linguistic communities that would have taken place between this massive trade route. This ability to track now at high resolution these detailed elements of human isotopes, metal isotopes, trace elements, etc., enables us to color in the picture that would have otherwise been a big arrow or a big explanation of the metallurgical transformation. But in this case, it gives us a capacity to talk about choices people are making. And the people who were living in Mushistan, to my understanding, were not living in a major urban center with huge hierarchical governments. These were mountain miners who had to make choices on how to articulate their materials into a broader economic network. Examples of this, for example, going back to the site of Dali, which I introduced earlier, we have comparable materials of small-scale miners, people who were exploiting, in this case, most likely copper, utilizing local ores, using stone hammer tools like those found elsewhere in Kazakhstan, documented by Thomas Stollner. So typologically, we have evidence for people doing mining at very small scales. Again, making the choice to spend less time keeping their animals or less time growing millet or wheat and more time mining. The interesting thing about Dali is that we haven't found a single seed at the site. It's 1 kilometer away from Tasbas, where there's tons of seeds. Well, many. Tons is probably an overstatement. But there's many. And so these two neighboring sites had a division of labor, a set of choices that were different. It's possible that Dali itself was a mining community, living exactly next door to a pastoral and farming community. So again, choices about how you articulate with different networks who your connections are, what the value of your work is, and how it shapes your everyday life is something that we now have the capacity to talk about at a high level when looking at Central Asian archaeology, and to reconstruct, in a sense, the Chaîne répertoire of mining, production, and ultimately finished artifacts. I'd like to introduce a little bit of collaborative work that I'm doing with Miljana Radivojevic from University College London, where we analyzed some samples from Dali and Bigash from the metallurgical assemblage, both slag, production slag, as well as some ores, ore fragments, as well as finished products. In this case, you see finished products from copper metal from Dali and Bigash, and where they plot in terms of this lovely publication or lovely data set of regional ores. And what you can see is that the finished objects that were being ostensibly produced at Dali and Bigash, so highlighted here in green and red, have very, very different trace elements than the nearest ores to them. The ores that would be closest to them are these, northeastern Kazakhstan. So these come from central Kazakhstan, so different vector. And when you start to reconstruct the networks between these different objects and their ore sources, you see that by the early Bronze Age, in the early Bronze Age, there were very, very distinctive patterns of connectivity. In some cases, no connectivity. By the Middle Bronze Age, the two sites, Dali and Bigash, which themselves are no more than 100 kilometers or 150 kilometers away from one another, were part of two distinctively different set of trade choices. One trading more, I believe, to the north, the other one trading more to the central regions. So these network analyses of where the ores are coming from and where they're ending up amongst neighboring populations of the same chronological period suggests that life was not all about just waking up and doing what your neighbor did, but in fact we have elements where we can illustrate differentiation of choice for reasons in this case that are hard to predict. Maybe they liked the material better, maybe it fit their aesthetic better, maybe they preferred one thing over the other. By the late Bronze Age, of course, it becomes more complicated, but no less distinctive. In fact, central and northeastern Kazakhstani metal is still operating in its unique set of networks, whereas eastern Kazakhstani metal is being circulated in yet another network. And it's just an intensification of different choices shaping the world along the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor, at least. The last set of choices, or close to the last set of choices I want to discuss, is that of kinship. Because, of course, making choices about what you eat and who you trade with or what you wear around your neck is one thing, but who you love is another. And we have an emerging picture now of high-resolution genomics that gives us some insights as to how choices were being made and which choices were being made amongst regional populations. Some of them form somewhat expectable patterns, like the decline of genetic distribution along the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor is sort of standard, people bumping into their neighbors and mating with them or intermarriage or something. Occasionally you have much more, there's a pie chart missing somewhere here underneath that error. There should be a pie chart right there that looks exactly like the one on the other side. I don't know why it's missing. Anyhow, that Yamnaya migration is a singular event, a singular choice by individuals, maybe not many, to walk very far across the Eurasian steppe, I suppose, or ride a wagon, I don't know. But that's a very unique choice. Most of the choices reflected in this map are standard kind of neighboring kinship systems that give you clinal distributions of genetic makeup. But when we start to pick this thing apart, we begin to see that even under those broad categories, there's a lot of individual choices happening. So for example, if we look at the makeup of the Eurasian steppe without Yamnaya communities' involvement, so these are all the sort of primordial populations with this eastern hunter-gatherer component, the green component, the rest of their components are slightly different, again, reflecting different kinds of regional mating strategies, kinship networks, etc. And when we dive into further work, this is the work published recently about the Tarim mummies, we see that this picture becomes even more extreme. The Tarim mummies, who we already spoke about, right? We already have clear evidence that they were trading and interacting with wheat-bearing communities of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. This is well established in textiles and wheat and other commodities. But those mummies have no drops of genetics, not a single drop of genetics from the corridor, at least in their own makeup. In fact, their makeup is so distinctive that it can be used to indicate a primordial population of communities that can then be modeled back into the corridor. So again, inverting the level of interaction and choice making to go the other direction. So this is a really interesting paper if you haven't seen it. When it is all said and done, what we realize is that the genetics gives us a picture of, in some cases, high levels of interaction or let's say admixture. And in other cases, it gives us pictures of complete genetic isolation. And both things can be true, while at the same time, communities are interacting culturally. So again, typological thinking about what this culture is and what that culture is and whether it's migration or diffusion isn't going to get us very far at this point. The data is too rich. We need to accept that the choices people are making are in fact the fundamental factor in how we reflect that data set. So again, going back to this interesting pocket of the Altai Mountains where we have this unique Afanasyevo community, which is essentially an imported community or migratory community from the West. Nearby, initially, we don't see an enormous amount of interaction. People are making choices either to not interact with locals, or locals are making choices not to interact with these newcomers. But that only lasts so long, and as time goes on, we begin to see that nearby communities start to blend. And so we start to see that communities that were, say, let's call them aboriginal populations, communities who have greater percentages of indigenous stepic genetic material, begin to introduce elements from the Afanasyevo eventually. And so it becomes complex, even those within the same culture group. So Chimorchek, for example, which is a very complex cultural group in its own right, from a material perspective, has different communities, different kinds of genetic makeup. So it's a much more heterogeneous population in terms of its genetic makeup, all under the same cultural category of Chimorchek. This shouldn't be surprising when we delve further into the Eurasian chronology. By 2000 BC, the Eurasian steppe has been mixed up numerous times. And if we think about genetics in the sort of perhaps inappropriate metaphor of these different shades of paint, by the time we get to 2000 BC, none of these colors are in fact primary. They're all mixed up already. But nevertheless, the composition, we can distinguish between different sources, and the geography then plays an interesting role. For example, if we take these two major blocks, like the green represents essentially the BMAC territory, this represents the northern steppe and the inner Asian mountain corridor, the central steppe and western steppe, you notice that the geographic alignment of these communities isn't necessarily adjacent. So remember, Tasbas and Dali are less than a kilometer away from one another. And on a PCA, these two sites have very different genetic makeup. I mean, they're not totally different, but they have different choices, different kinship networks. Interesting, though, that they're right next to one another. In fact, next to Tasbas, which lies much closer to the BMAC in its genetic makeup, at least the individuals we sampled, is much closer to populations living in Tajikistan today. So this genomic layout gives us a much broader sense of understanding the kinds of choices people are making. In fact, we can even say more. In the paper we published in 2019, we did the exercise of essentially aggregating, or let's say creating the clusters, the PCA clusters, for the bulk of individuals, let's say in this case around the Gonur, or let's say the BMAC. And then the same for the steppe pastoralist sites, in this case Sintasht, I believe, is reflected here. All of the individuals that you see outside of those gray areas are found at the exact same sites. So each of these sites, perhaps not unsurprisingly, is cosmopolitan, in which case you have communities from all over the place who are living alongside these main clusters, much like we experience in urban centers today, but also in centers where it isn't so urban. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that this obsession I'm having on the idea of making different choices plays itself out in the kinds of individuals who are around you and the way in which genetics, at least at this early stage of interaction, is reflected in different communities. Yet if you were to dig up these burials and look at them from a material perspective, they would all look Andronovo, or they'd all look BMAC, right? We wouldn't distinguish them from a material typological perspective. And maybe we shouldn't. It's okay that people have different genetic backgrounds and associate with the same culture, so to speak. I'm just simply saying that when we get down into the granularity of it, we see that these cosmopolitan communities, be they pastoralists or urbanites, have an extremely wide array of choices that give them that shade in this complex picture of life in the Bronze Age. So what do we do then with the good old Andronovo culture? This is a quote from Grigoriev, recently published, which I am very glad to read because it to me signals a shift in the mentality amongst our Russian colleagues about the utilization of typological cultures. And basically, the nutshell argument is we cannot use the Andronovo culture anymore. It's a nonsensical category. You might as well just say Steppe Bronze Age. That's all it actually means, because to anybody who understands the diversity, either genetic, material, metallurgical, or any other, in my view, the Andronovo culture served as a term, or even the Andronovo cultural community as a term, serves to obscure any processes that were actually going on. It just makes it into sort of us saying, pick a name, right? Americans, Germans, Italians. I mean, tell any person from any group that they're all the same, right? So to my mind, it's now time, right, for us to finally abandon some of these cultural categories for good. And this might be heretical amongst the community of Eurasianists who have been forced and or have fully engaged in the idea of these cultural groups. But I really think that we're at a scientific stage now where it just becomes less helpful than it does helpful. To dig into this a bit deeper, I mean, this is sort of our classic typology of some of the Andronovo materials. And I myself cannot distinguish them on the ground. And I've spent 20 years looking at Andronovo ceramics, and I can find an element of every type of everything in everything I look at. So please, I know there are people here who are better than me, and I appreciate your skill set, but I cannot do it. In fact, I've even shown ceramics from North America to my colleagues who are experts in Eurasian ceramics, and they've been, oh yeah, it's alla cool. That's alla cool. When in fact it's from Cahokia. It's just a cruel joke. But nevertheless, we do use the ceramics obviously for broad categorical purposes, I understand. And here again we were excited to find globular incised ceramics with punctate designs at an early Bronze Age site of Dali in a pit house. Again, we were even more excited when we started to find ceramics that had designs that articulated with the Chimurchek and Okuniev pots, which we just saw in the previous slide. That's exciting. But when we begin to realize that as you evolve through these sites and the populations are making choice after choice, that you can't necessarily attribute it to some massive cultural change. Here again, we see the chronology. This site is relatively reused over and over again for 2,000 years. And if you look at the composition of the materials from a technological perspective, you see that in the earliest phase, over here, I guess I'm getting it, yeah, is sort of the initial steps, the initial chenapatoire for making those early phase ceramics. And rather than abandoning those forms, those elements, they just tack on new ones. So these are new choices. Every generation, every time slice that we want to open up, early Bronze Age, middle Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, final Bronze Age, pre-final Bronze Age, however you want to break it down chronologically, you can begin to articulate new and illustrate new choices, new elements, new sources, new technologies being introduced to the repertoire. They don't lose the old stuff. So what this suggests is, again, this kind of admixture process of selective choices, where you know how to do things, you've always done them the same way, but as new populations enter, as new communities interact, as new networks are formed, new choices are made available. Another example of this, which I recently read about by Elise Luneau, who's in the audience as well, is a wonderful study of ceramics at Uçkurbu, where I didn't have the capacity, Elise, to fully explain all the differences, because they're quite detailed. But essentially, there's differences in paste, there's differences in source, there's differences in technology of making the ceramics. And the best way to describe this is under the main findings list there, that essentially you've got a minimum of 3, if not more, individual types of ceramics decorated in a similar fashion, or let's say, in this case, shaped in a similar fashion, at the same site. So not only do you have choices being made at the site level, but you have different choices being made at the family level. So my interpretation, please, I'm happy to be corrected, is at Uçkurbu, is that we're now down to the level where we can begin to understand the choices in Şanapatuar being made by individual people. And that data set is not unavailable to us given the science that we have. And then being able to ratchet up and compare that set of choices to other choices, it's less about seeing them as part of cultural communities, but rather seeing them in terms of the kinds of communication that we really want to understand. So, my final pitch is to oust the misleading typology. And I'd like to propose and then dispose of a new cultural category called the Krasnaya Avta culture. It's just as good as the Andronovo, as far as I'm concerned. They look very similar at one level. And so if anybody here is happy to trade my Lada for your Porsche 911, I'll be the first to get in line. I thought about this a long time ago, and I've written about what I think about typologies and the use of the Andronovo culture in general. And it's not just about being polemical. I don't actually care if it's in a paper, if you've written it, I've written it. But it's not a very useful term, and the approach, whether it be to revolutions, typologies, stages of agricultural development, innovations in metallurgy, or distributions of genetics, all of these different areas are now at a point in scientific research in the Eurasian steppe, thanks to the last 20 or more years, right, including the Soviet era prior, to truly be able to get down to some of the levels where we can move beyond simply saying these people were pastoralists, or these people were farmers, or these people were metallurgists and they made their metals with this kind of thing. We can actually say that this is an incredibly complex world of choices. So, to wrap up, what would our illustrious sponsor think? Well, I did a bunch of reading about him this last couple of days, interested to find out what he might feel about my potential rejection of typology, and given his devotion, at least to the initial stages of typological thinking and the importance to our discipline. I think he'd be okay with it. In his own fashion, he was a bit of a dilettante, and in his own fashion, he, I think, felt that the system that he was given was inappropriate for understanding the content and material he had at hand. And I think that Eurasian archaeology has matured in the last decades, again, and this is not to discredit the many decades of work prior, but in the last decades, with the advent of new research, advent of new research methods, the introduction of genetics, isotopes, etc., all of these new methods that we can get down to extremely granular levels, I'd like to think that we are now able to better relive the lives of our forefathers and to wander and move among them. Thank you.
Thank you, microphone.
Step down because of the microphone. Anyway, okay, go ahead. Can I just see where you are? So I can look
Here.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'd like to go back to where you started from in this idea of revolutions, or not revolutions. I'm not trying to promote revolutions, but I wonder sometimes about what I would say kind of current fashion of saying the Neolithic was not a revolution or the urban was not a revolution because it took so long.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that this is, what this raises really is a perspective issue. Are we talking about how it felt to people who were living it and doing it, or how does it feel, or how do we evaluate these things looking back? And when we look back, we typically still say, whether we like it or not, that Neolithic was a major revolution, for example. Yeah. So I was curious what your thought was on that. And then I wanted to connect it to your emphasis on choice. Because if I understood you correctly, you were suggesting that revolutions and choices don't go together, and I find that a little odd. We have only to look at Iran right now.
No, I would say the opposite. So let me answer the first question quickly. I think you hit it exactly how I would explain it as well, is that if you look at it from an archaeological sort of heuristic perspective, then I'm happy to have us call the 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 year process of people becoming farmers revolutionary. I still think it kind of, falls a little bit flat in the sense that if you look at the way Child used it, I mean, he really saw a culmination to something like this, like it happened at some point. And the graphs I showed were completely anecdotal. I just kind of thought to myself, right, at what stage does sort of the majority of Eurasia have access to agriculture? It's not till quite late at some level, right? So it does take about 4,000 years. So at an experiential level, going back to sort of the first option, none of it is revolutionary. It's in fact a simple set of, whether you do something or not. That being said, none of what I'm talking about is relevant to what I would argue is like a political, revolution. These are different, manifestations of the term. And in that regard, of course, eventually, enough people making a certain set of choices can have a sudden impact. And I think that there are cases for that in archaeology, fewer than we have evidence for. I'd say more than we probably have evidence for. Maybe the Yamnaya migration was truly revolutionary in the sense that, this community, I was asked recently by a journalist who's writing a book on, the dreaded Indo-European language, and asked whether the Yamnaya were the ones who did this. And I tiptoed around the question and backed away from it in a lot of ways. But the short answer is no. And the answer is no because that's not how languages change. They're not necessarily revolutionary because people have to learn them. And so even if you can take a language and slap it on top of a society and say, you must know this. But those languages don't change very rapidly. So there are a few cases where even when we see sudden and impactful choice, that we see what we might imagine as revolution. Now, I'm sure there are cases that you know of, either historically, of course we know of them. Archaeologically, I'd be interested to know. There might be cases of uprisings and other kinds of things that could be categorized that way. But in my archaeological world, at least in terms of the data that I have access to, I think that populations making choices can be impactful, and they can be influential, and they can be innovative. But I wouldn't characterize them as revolutionary in that same sense. So it's really very much a question of semantics at that level. And I do agree that it depends on which perspective you're taking. If you're looking at a back-looking heuristic perspective, the fact that up until 10,000 years, roughly, no one was growing anything, or very little agriculture was taking place on the planet, and today, the vast majority of the world is engaged in some form of farming, is a massive change. But I think the sentiment around revolution that was inspiring Child to write about it was something that was much more sort of instantaneous or sudden. So maybe I'm wrong. Thanks.
Yeah, more questions? Oh, it seems to be,
Yes, thank you for the talk. And I go a little bit in the same direction as what Susan asked. The paradigm of choice that was underlying your whole talk. What you did is you showed us with all these methods out of the mainly natural sciences, an incredible variability of Central Asia in the time periods that you considered. And then you always came back and you said, well, people choose. They made a choice. What I would ask is, well, people did something, certainly, and you can find that out archaeologically. However, when you use the terminology of choice, does that imply that this was a discursive act? That is, at what level of consciousness was that in the minds of the people who acted? Because there is also the possibility that there was a practical consciousness behind this. That is something that was not really up to the level of making a choice. It went by itself, and that would be actually an interesting exercise to try to disentangle these two types of action.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I didn't have time to go into my sort of theoretical apparatus behind this question of choice. So it's a very appropriate question, and I'll delve into it for a minute. So this whole obsession I'm having these days with the idea of choice isn't just because I want to have a funny new word to talk about what we find archaeologically. It stems from what has essentially been, I don't know, Lenny, how many years ago did you graduate your PhD? 7. 7 years ago, amongst the community of graduate students and myself at Washington University, we were having a lot of conversations about what I kind of considered to be this model of non-uniform complexity. And that model suggests that people make different kinds of alignments in different kinds of institutional ways. So you can find, for example, trade networks that go in one direction and religious, or let's say, burial styles that go in a different one. So the whole concept of non-uniform complexity is rooted in the idea that people have access to variable sets of options, and they don't necessarily package them into complex units all the time. So politics and religion and economy and subsistence don't necessarily always move in a unitary package. So breaking down the notion of sort of hierarchical progress, or let's say teleological progress between different phases. So this led me then to the problem of, okay, well then how do they make this select set of selections? And to answer your question in short, yes, I do think that they're making a very specific intellectual decision, just as we all made today. We decided to put a jacket on. You didn't have to. You could have come in a bathing suit. There's nothing to stop you. But you would have been cold, first of all, and people probably would have looked at you funny, second of all. So you're talking about the articulation between habitus, on the one hand, the things that you just do because everyone does them. You could have also worn a rooster suit. They're very warm. You could be fine if you were here dressed like a rooster. Different choice, right? So any one of the choices you made, you put on the coat that you have, and you bought the coat you have because of some habitus that these are the coats that are available. But you can make the choice, and you have that freedom. So there's a key here. One is that within the realm of habitus, power determines whether you have the choice. In the Bronze Age, I think people had the choice. They were given options, and they had to make specific case studies, or specific decisions to say, you know what, we're going to go in this route. Now, maybe not every single human being was making those decisions. Maybe some of them said, well, that's where my grandfather would go, and so I'm going to go with the same group of people who we've been trading with for a long time. But I do think that choices are made in a much more conscientious way. And we've thus, through typology, largely stripped communities of choice. And I'm not talking about agency in that kind of vague way. I'm talking about specific, detailed choices. Are you going to grow millet or wheat? Because we can see two sites next to each other that are doing very different things with the exact same environment. So they're adapting in different ways. However you want to word it, they're making different choices. When it gets time to be hungry, they have to make a choice. And so I do think that people had conscientious choice in the past. I don't want to strip them of that. And I think that when we start to think about this question of broader institutional frames around which choices are conditioned, we have to deal with the problem of participation on the one hand. So who do you participate with? Because if you wear a chicken suit or a rooster suit to this meeting, you're not really participating in the same way, right? You're kind of being a bit of you're outside the norm, right? So you're not participating. If you go to a sports game and you don't play by the rules, you're not participating. So we went then from non-uniform complexity to the idea of participation to really getting down to the most granular element of that, which is that choice, when given the opportunity to make a choice, you have to either make it, or even by not making a choice, you're making some form of choice. So I do think that there's a very conscientious element to this. And I'm not particularly intimidated by this being unattainable to archaeologists. I mean, I think this is the biggest fear, right, is that archaeologists are afraid to talk about, maybe not this group of archaeologists, but many archaeologists are afraid to talk about these kinds of very human things because it demands that we tell people that people 4,000 years ago actually weren't just in this evolutionary track that led us to this wonderful world that we're in today. And I would argue that that's the underlying sort of narrative here, is this is an anti-evolution, anti-teleological argument, that your choices can lead you backward in some progressive way. And so rather than see those ramps of progress, I just didn't put progress, I just put intensity and geography. And so I do think that I'm standing here in a way sort of arguing against the idea that we are part of a social evolutionary track that moves us towards something that is inherently better. In fact, I would argue that some of the choices we've made as a society over the last 10,000 years have led us to a quite dystopian world. But that's a different lecture. So I'll leave it for the next time. Thank you.
More questions?
Sabina.
Maybe another follow-up and a remark. Is the choice not a matter of scale? Because when we look on the Eurasian scale, reproduce the same ornaments for a long time across a very large area, and as you correctly say, it's very difficult to divide them, and when you have radiocarbon dates for a lot of them, you see a complete chaos, and the same chaos in Western Siberia or in Eastern Siberia. So people, obviously at that level, had very little choice not to make an anatomical pattern. So maybe the choice that you talked about now is a choice that is only on a very, very individual, small-scale level, and at the upper level or other levels, people had much less choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting angle because we have to certainly agree that these ceramics look a lot alike. I mean, maybe we could call it false consciousness. I don't know, right? I mean, and this is an interesting thing. When Elon Musk made his first electric car, he put a grill on the front of it, to ventilate the car. But it doesn't have an engine. Why did he put that there? Because he was concerned that people wouldn't buy the car because it didn't look like a car. It didn't have a grate on the front, to let the air go through. So I think these kinds of material, let's call them conservatism, may have held some really important role for these populations, and the ability to make ceramics in a certain way for certain kinds of decorative fashion to stay put for quite a long time. I mean, I can't really explain that. That seems to me just that people kind of got stuck in a set of stylistic norms that they liked or that were good. But I wouldn't say that those ceramics are the only way to look at them, right? And this is the work that a lot of people are doing now, right? It's looking, as you say, like at the details of those work is completely different. So, this is an alternative example, but biologists, in the 1990s were talking about race, and one of the arguments that they used for the lack of biological support for the idea of race was that the gene that selects for skin color, which is the dominant, characteristic used to distinguish race, is no more prominent, or let's say no more influential in the total genome than the gene for eye color, or if your hair is curly or straight. So this was, if they'd had the information that these were equally reflected in the genome, we might have a world in which race was determined by, eye color or the curliness of your hair or whatever, right? In which case the entire history of humanity would be alternatively oriented. And so the history of ceramics is dictated by how they look and what they're shaped like, because that's what we had access to as early ceramic specialists. But today we have access to a much more genomic perspective, right? We can get inside those ceramics and tell us not only what they were built like, but what materials they were used, how they were formed, what temperature they were formed at, all these other wonderful details, which allows us to revolutionize our understanding of similarity. And I would love for a student, I don't have the patience or skill set, but a wonderful, smart student should take the entire corpus of ceramics, sample them, and build a new typology based on a different trait. And the Andronovo culture would look like something very, very different. I guess what I'm trying to say is that choice doesn't strip the idea of choice. It just means that some things maybe weren't important to choose. And this comes back, I think, a bit to Reinhardt's point as well, that some things are just the way you do them, and there's really no need to make a choice. And of course, we can't access that as easily than the ones that were chosen, right? So when you do choose to put quartz or something into your ceramic for a particular set of reasons, we can catch it now. And I think that that's still valuable to take a look at.
Continue the discussion. If people make their own history or their own choices by their free will or under the given conditions, and we invite you now for a small reception. And thank you again, Michael, for this fantastic talk.
Thank you.